the new bill in the House bill.
That's what we were just, yeah. I
They're gonna
was
change-
like,
they're gonna-
morning.
What?
I like your, I like your new face.
Oh, thank
Hi, Jen.
Hi, how are you?
you. Good. Want mine to
You
do a
expecting
bill?
trouble
It's
or?
getting crowded in here.
Yeah.
No, I'm gonna stay out of this.
All right.
I'm especially to stay out of this.
Thanks. Catherine, do you mind?
What?
You charge the door?
No, that's fine.
What?
And,
No, just.
wow.
We live? Yes, looks like it. Thanks. Welcome to Senate Education, start of the week, this Tuesday, February 13th. And we are starting with Ms. Del Neo. If you don't mind joining us. Trying to get in, start a little early each week, so we get out a little early, also given that it's chairs meetings on Monday, so appreciate you coming over again and following up on your request. We are talking about S303, and you had mentioned last week when you were in one of the side chairs that you'd like to come in and talk a little bit about different parts of the district. So with that, please, let us start with your thoughts.
Sure. My name is Catherine Zelmano. I'm the state librarian and commissioner of the Department of Libraries, and I really appreciate this opportunity to speak with you about S303 and act relating to supporting Vermont's young readers. And I wanted to share with you that the department's supportive of S303 as it relates to extending the advisory council on literacy through June 30th, 2027. I did prepare some remarks very late. I think that your liaison put them into your
Yeah,
packet.
right.
So I'll just, I'll keep to the remarks. The council is charged with advising the Secretary of Education and right now others on improvements to proficiency outcomes and literacy for students in pre-kindergarten through grade 12 and how to sustain those incomes. I'm sorry, those outcomes.
Just to make sure, yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry, I
No, no, no.
misread. Embarrassing for a state librarian to misread.
It's not.
Given the role that public libraries play in supporting pre-literacy, the department respectfully requests that the state librarian or their designee be added to the council's ex officio membership. Our hope is that adding the state librarian or their designee to the advisory council on literacy will enable the department to be part of the conversation about a holistic approach to literacy that starts as soon as a child is born, when they are issued their public library card, when their parent brings them to the library.
Great, so let's just pause there for a moment.
Sure.
So we have the council here with us, so you want you or the designee to be on as an ex officio member. Why ex officio?
Because it matches, so I was looking at page 5, line 12
Yeah.
of the bill, and if you go to the last page of my prepared testimony, you'll see what we were suggesting. In the past, there had been, last year, the former Secretary of Education had reached out to me about serving on the committee in one of the other roles, and there wasn't really a spot for the state librarian.
I see.
And because I don't have a child, I couldn't serve. So it seems like there is a role all the time for the state librarian or the youth services consultant.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to ask you, tell me what you mean. You don't have a child, so you're not allowed to serve?
The only open positions were
Oh.
for parents.
I see.
So that wasn't really, the idea of being an ex officio member is really looking at the role of the department, how the department supports public libraries specifically,
Okay.
because public libraries support parents and caregivers and guardians in beginning kids on the road to reading success. So when I was here last Friday, and we were looking at the learning platform, and we watched a small video, they talked, the expert in the video on literacy talked about pre-literacy and how you need the fundamental building blocks at the beginning.
Mhm.
If you jump in at kindergarten and you haven't had any pre-literacy activities, you are already behind. So the public library is, for so many Vermonters, bridging that gap at the beginning that may exist. Parents often haven't been to a public library, haven't been to a library, haven't thought about a picture book, a board book, a nursery rhyme, or a song for children. since they were kids themselves. And they have to be reminded that that is actually, it's not just a tradition, it's actually fundamental to language acquisition. And that repetition of syllables, the learning and the hearing that goes on will actually help the child later on when they get to the point of learning to decode language. And the science, at this point, for many years, has supported early childhood literacy as the foundation. And I have had a long career in children's services. I was a youth services librarian. I have a school media specialist, did master's degree for library science. And I served as a children's librarian and then a middle and high school public services library, public library staff member. And then I was a branch manager / children's librarian. So I've got probably 15 or 16 years in children's services and delivering those programs myself, and have had great experience of having training such as Every Child Ready to Read training, where the librarians are taught the principles, the science of early childhood literacy, and how playing and singing and talking and simple things that parents can do every day at the grocery store, just talking as they go about their day, how that's going to support a child in learning. And so when I look at the council, I see that we've got a gap. We have the birth through pre-K, and in many Vermont communities, there's not a pre-K. So we have the birth through kindergarten years. So the kids who don't have parents who are, the kids who aren't fortunate enough to have parents who are really reading up on that, don't have such a great entry point to literacy, and they may have a lesser outcome when they begin their elementary school careers because they can't identify numbers, they can't identify letters, they haven't been hearing the repeated rhythmic language through children's literature. Their parents might have some books in their home library, but they don't have a practice coming to the public library every week. And their parents don't know how to read the books with them. We don't just read the book. At the library, we model an engaged reading practice. So the librarian reads and pauses, and there's some interaction with the kids. And that's really what a parent should be doing at home if they're trying to really have reading comprehension, which is a building block of literacy. So when we look at the role of the public library, my point is really that somebody from the state library, where we have trained professionals, we have a youth services consultant. We also have me currently as the state librarian, but not every state librarian has my background. And that's why I thought the state librarian or their designee would be a good way to do it. We have people who have experience in this realm and who lead continuing education programs for public librarians. And we have over the years had a relationship with VLI, the Vermont Early Literacy Initiative, which is a part of Vermont Humanities, training a cohort of learners. And we give a grant to Humanities to support VLI. But I feel that we need more than that. So this year we're launching a series of trainings for every librarian in Vermont who wishes to take them on the science of reading, how to build story time, and really serve as a model for the parents, but also an educator using plain language that people can understand. When we talk to a parent and we talk about phonological awareness, they start glazing over. And so really trying to meet the parents where they are, meet the caregivers where they are. Even I'd like to get to the point where librarians in our state have the training that they need to go and serve as a resource at a local preschool to teach a preschool teacher how to read with kids. I know that this is something that hasn't been done as much in Vermont, but in the framework that I came from previously, both in New Jersey and Somerset County Library System, and then in San Francisco, we did a lot of professional development around the science of reading. And that's the type of thing that I think could be helpful on the Literacy Council, just having that framework and starting kids at that birth point with a public library card, with access to hundreds, thousands of books, with access to library professionals who are helping them to select books and utilize those books. And every book, one book's not perfect for every kid. So going into the library and doing that matching and being exposed to all of the books in a story time is so important. And I think that for us, kind of leveling up the skill set of the practitioners in the field, giving them what they've asked the department for through the working group report. They really asked for more training for youth services librarians, many of whom don't have a degree in library science, a master's degree, but they want to learn. They're doing great work now, just naturally and through their communities of practice, but we'd like to support them in growing that further at the department, and we'll begin that this year. But really thinking about it as a constant, and that's really why my recommendation would not be to add somebody in a kind of rotating role, but to have some continuity from the department so that this doesn't fall off fall out of line again, because I think it probably should have been there from the beginning.
Any objection to this request? Great.
And I did check with Agency of Education and the interim secretary and her team were supportive of this addition as well.
Okay, great. Please, continue with your testimony.
Well, I think I just said it all.
Oh, it is, great,
Verbatim.
great.
I
You got it
really,
memorized.
yeah, I'm happy to talk with you more about it or answer questions you might have about what public libraries can do
Great.
and what we'd like to see them do. But I think I covered the high points. So if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to answer them. But I know you've got a lot of your notes today.
It's great. If you don't mind sticking around,
I'm happy to
for a
stick
little bit,
around.
that'd be great. Yeah, please introduce us.
Thank you.
Oh, Catherine, I just have one quick question with a little preface, which is that you just made me get a little misty eyed as I was getting nostalgic. Over the early years of reading to my kids, which it just hit me that those were like best times, right? Like I just really relished those moments, and shout out to Eric Carl, because I think I read Brown Bear like 150 times. My baby. But thank you so much for this testimony. It's really, really important and powerful. I'm trying to bring this conversation a little bit full circle with Senator Williams's bill, thinking about screens and devices. Do you know if there's any, I think I know the answer to this, but do you know if there's any evidence that would point to, voices on a screen being similarly effective as actual people in terms of developing language and literacy skills?
I would have to go back and look into the exact research. My recollection, what I've read over the years, and I may answer it in a slightly different way. The role of the parent's voice, the relationship in person with the parent is absolutely essential. I think if there were a parent working with a child, for example, I was at the Winooski Public Library last week, and they have a lot of parents who they serve in that community who are not fluent in any language. So for them to read would be difficult, not just in English, but in their native tongues. There is research definitely that, and I don't have great recall for who said it when, and I could look that up if you'd like, but there is research that shows that what's most important is that parents read fluidly, that there's a fluid reading to the child. So if a parent speaks, their native language is French, that they read books in French to their child. That is more important than teaching them to read English and maybe reading in imperfect English. You're trying to teach in a fluent way so that the child understands the rhythm of the language. And if you want to know more about what we would do in story time, we think about a baby rhyme time, for example. And that's for as soon as the parents feel comfortable taking the kid out of the house, they bring them to these programs. And as you're rhyming, just a basic rhyme like Humpty Dumpty, patting the child, feeling the rhythm of the language. There's a lot of bouncing of the baby, gentle bouncing, of course, really influencing how they're hearing the words and how it's a whole body activity. Reading isn't something where you sit and push and swipe. There are products and there are tools that kids like. Sometimes that's the only way to get a book in a language for a child. But I think that connection with the parent, the connection with their caregiver, their grandparent, that relationship. My boyfriend talks about bringing his kid to the Ilsley Library every week when she was little, that was something that really meant a lot to them. Developing that practice of reading is a very important thing. And the parents actually build a community of support in those settings. So I think that there is a value, and there has also been research about books being kind of mentally stickier, I would say. So, I'm sure people can learn to read if they just have a tablet. It's probably better than not having it. But for children, for the youngest children, the pre-literacy activities include flipping the pages. They include eating the board book, smelling the board book, ripping the board book. Those are things that actually lead to reading. That's some of their print motivation and print readiness.
Can I just follow up?
So, yeah, please, go ahead.
Sorry.
So this bill would actually be a precursor to S 204.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And if you wanna talk about my bill, if we ever get a chance to see the testimony,
Mhm.
it's addressed it.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
I was gonna make one last comment.
So,
No, it's okay. I remember when I was working a librarian, every once in a while, I'd get some folks in who would, they were so happy to be there and they vocalized that libraries had not been good to them when they were young for whatever reason. Either they had been disciplined for talking or being loud, or they had to pay fines, and so we really had to kind of reset how they felt about libraries, and I'm sure you are doing that, but I hadn't really thought about it until people told me that was how they were feeling.
Yeah, and I think that is something that libraries in Vermont are doing great work to overcome. That's one of the reasons so many libraries have gone fine free. I did a lot of work when I was in San Francisco to help the library to really study fines and how they impact library users in that community. And the studies that we did over multiple years showed that the communities of color were most impacted. The poorer communities were most impacted. The 10-cent fine doesn't mean anything to a person who has resources. But that damage that's caused can be quite extensive. And really, when we look at equity and access and look at the working groups findings on those topics, it's really important that Vermonters who are newcomers feel welcomed in a library. Our department has a kind of a newcomer collection, which in some ways is kind of geared toward the people accepting the newcomers, but we also are looking at building out our language collections and finding ways to support people with those resources, because a lot of people coming to the US don't have the tradition of a public library like we have here. So when you go to other countries, some have strong public libraries and some it's a completely foreign notion. They've just never heard of that. And so really explaining to people what we do. The department used some of our ARPA funding to just make a fact sheet about libraries and explain this is what you can do at a library, and translated it into, I think, 16 languages. And talking with folks in Winooski and learning, well, people can't read it. They may speak a language, but they may not be able to read it. So now I'm looking at, could we do videos and have native speakers share the message so that people can get that information?
We have some new Vermonters whose language, it doesn't exist in written form.
Right. Yeah, so really working to break down those barriers and to help make sure that people feel welcomed and that there are materials for them, and that we have an ability to serve them, and thinking about how will those little kids become great readers. So, you know, if you've got bilingual parents, like my niece and nephew have bilingual parents, and so my niece is being read to in Chinese and then she's being read to in English, and you know, everybody does their part, and it's going to all help with her literacy in the long run. And I think that that's a really important thing to remember, that what's important is learning that skill, practicing with your ears, practicing that breaking down of language, that rhythm of talking, and really thinking it's fun. I mean, that's part of what happens, is that if you've never sat in the seat and listened and you don't enjoy the story, good luck in kindergarten. You will have a hard time. So getting kids ready to learn is one of the things that the public library can help with. So that's really where I see the importance of having the state librarian, or perhaps the youth services consultant or someone else in the department, if they have stronger skills in that area. I personally would love to serve myself on the council and set us off on a path, really working together so that it's a nice handoff, and so that the parents feel supported as they become their children's first teachers. And that's really what they are. And if they don't know how to do that, we want to give them want to help them get those skills by up-leveling what our practitioners feel of all of the librarians know and can share about literacy.
One final question I have is, you mentioned if you have two parents, arriving in the United States, they don't speak English. Did you say that it's helpful for them to read and speak in their native tongue? That in that way to support their child's understanding of English?
Yeah, and if you're
More, they feel the enthusiasm. or
it will eventually help the child learn to be literate in whichever language.
Right.
And if they don't have access to books, then, and if a family were, if there were a family that spoke a language and their local library didn't have books, we would do interlibrary loan to get them books to try to help them. But say they didn't read, singing songs in their native tongue, conversing, describing their day, going about what they're doing, and knowing that that is something that is important to do. I used to,
More important than reading it, like if I were to read French, it's broken.
yeah, the idea is that you want that fluidity,
Got it.
you want to learn the pattern of the language. And you want to have that kind of oral with an AU, oral, sense of the language and memory and the pattern and the repetition. And with picture books also, the picture book format doesn't end once you get to kindergarten. We in libraries have picture books that go all the way up into the adult realm. The language in a well-written picture book, when you look at something like the award-winning Caldecott books, there's often interplay between the text and the images. There is, so sometimes the images and the text don't match. That's a point of conversation. You want to extend the book, not just read the book, right? Ask questions about the book, thinking about the book when you're walking around later on. So thinking about things like our story walks that we lend out from the library, where people have books out on sticks out in the community. Thinking about language all the time and really focusing on that and focusing on that. The spoken language is important, the sung language, and just getting the rhythm of the language is really important. But what the librarian can do, even in the absence of books in a language, is to show how important that is. So when I would do a story time, it wouldn't just be here are some books. You start with singing, you do some movement, you pivot if the kids aren't still interested. You're always kind of tweaking and finessing it to keep the kids interested in the program and to really get them excited and enthusiastic about learning together. And sometimes if I remember I used to do a story time, there were a lot of nannies who were Brazilian and spoke Portuguese. I didn't speak Portuguese, but they did. So they would lead some songs for the community, really pulling on the expertise in the community and working with people. And I think that's something that we'll be doing more training on these topics for the library community, but that's the type of thing that we want to help Vermont's libraries to do, and really thinking about expanding storytime offerings for different age groups so that it's great to have any story time, but we can do story times for finite little, groups of kids in developmental cohorts, and that can really be helpful too, because they have different needs.
Any final questions from this gentleman? So terrific. Tomorrow, I just want to let you know, we are going to mark up the public library bill. So and what we're going to do is we're going to have Tucker Anderson, I haven't gotten back yet, but
Okay.
basically take us through your recommendations. And say, hey, that sounds good. So we'll start that process tomorrow if you want to.
I'm planning to attend, so thank you for letting me know.
Okay, it's great. to see
Excited
you.
for that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
no, we're excited to have you as a partner in all this. St.
Thanks.
James. Yeah, as I recall, we have some outstanding questions that Ms. St. James flagged for us on Friday for S303 that she may have brought to the agency on our behalf. That is what we are looking at now. And are we looking at draft 2.1?
Yes.
Thank you. So draft 2.1 in our files. And so the floor is yours, and we also have a first year here for any backup. So please.
Thank you. Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. We're working with draft 2.1 of your committee amendment to S 303. Ted and I have had a chance to confer on some of the issues that I brought up, but it was after I had done all of this lovely highlighting and gotten a draft from Morgan. So there might be some settled areas on here that look unsettled. But I'm going to walk you through what's highlighted. It represents both the changes since draft 1.1, as well as some of the decision points that we talked about last week. And I have also marked up adding the ex officio member of the state librarian.
Thank you.
So
Thank you so much.
the next draft you see will contain that. So the first thing we're gonna look at is section 2. Remember, this is the requirement that I'm just gonna use a general term here, and then we'll delve into which term you all want to use, that teachers complete the mandatory literacy models, okay?
Okay.
And last time I came to you, I brought draft 1.1 of your committee amendment, was bringing you edits based on recommendations from AOE. And one of the terms they recommended using was this term professionally licensed. And that term confused me because I didn't find that specific term in Title 16, and I had reached out to the agency. We've since conferred. But in between Friday and talking to the agency, I located the definition for professionally licensed in the Professional Standards Board's rules for the licensing of teachers. And so whether you choose to keep it or not, I think it's a good piece for discussion for today. So what you have on page 1, starting on line 18, the highlighted subsection A, we got, actually I'm thinking of the other bill where we got rid of definitions, but I added the definition of this term taken from the Professional Standards Board's rules. So lots of policy choices here, right? Professionally licensed, according to that definition, does not include provisional, emergency, teaching intern, or apprenticeship licenses. Now, you don't have to go with this definition, right? I would just encourage you that regardless of who you require to complete these literacy modules, we don't have dueling terms with 2 different definitions to confuse folks. So if you like the definition of professionally licensed from the Standards Board, then I think there's nothing wrong with using that term here. If you want to modify this definition in any way, then I think we have to talk about whether or not professionally licensed is the correct term to use, because it might cause some confusion with the definition that appears in the Standards Board rules.
I think part of our decision will be based on how long somebody can have a provisional and emergency license. You can have a provisional license for 20 years, well, you've got a problem. But if it's provisional license max out for a certain period of time, you transition in, then I feel like we capture those folks. Do you have any?
I don't.
Okay, Mr. Fisher.
For the record, Ted Fisher, Vermont Agency of Education. I'm the agency's Director of Communications and Legislative Affairs. And at 2, my good friend and colleague, Andrew Prouton, who you have met virtually, will be here in person. He is the Assistant Director of Education Quality and Head of Licensing for us. He's a great person to answer that question, but I do just want to agree with Beth that the process of this is restricted to educators who are fully licensed. And just to add a little color to the decision point, the point of the emergency licenses, they would be working towards that fully licensed process. I'm looking in the green book, but Andrew can definitely mention it when he gets here. I'm sorry, he's just scheduled for 2 instead of 1:30.
Okay, so you just told us that Andrew's coming, that's it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got anything else, okay.
My only other question would be how many provisionals are out there? Because my understanding is there are a lot right now, so that would be another question we could ask.
Okay, so we'll wait when Andrew arrives, we'll ask those questions.
Great. So if we move on to page 2, all of the green are decision points. So this is not new. This is the language we looked at last week, but professionally licensed is the issue we just talked about. So that term, it sounds like we're waiting on another witness to find out if we're gonna use that term. The next decision point would be Vermont school. I brought up the fact that this could be an ambiguous term, depending on what your intent here is. Is it to include educators and the way that the rest of the statute reads, it would suggest that this term Vermont school includes approved independent schools and public schools.
The rest of the statute.
So if you look at subsection D,
Yeah,
it talks about public and approved independent schools that employ professionally licensed educators have to maintain a file on completion of the literacy module.
so that's already in statute.
No, this is brand new.
Oh,
All of this language is brand new.
got it. When you said if you reference statute, what do you mean?
This statute,
Oh,
so this bill,
This
the language we're looking at
Great.
is adding to your green book. And so I think I would just suggest that if you do want to require all licensed, and we'll figure out what that means, educators, and I should have, my highlighting is just, it's a good thing it's not a requirement to pass the bar. If you do want to require all licensed educators in both public and approved independent schools to complete these modules, then I think you should spell that out here. And if you don't, then you should pick which one and modify the rest of the statute accordingly.
Yeah, and I want to hear from the AOE on it, as well.
Okay.
And maybe take some more testimony. I don't know what the committee, I know where Senator Gulick is on this, but I don't know where everyone else is, so maybe we'll take a little bit more testimony.
And then the last decision point is just that term educator. Educator, as defined in the chapter that we are working with, includes teachers and administrators.
Right.
And then it's the term teacher would not include the administrators.
Right.
So that, again, decision point for you all.
So correct me if I'm wrong, it's probably wrong. Are you gonna ask AOE what they meant? Probably wrong.
Yes, but I think you should hear from them.
Okay, did they ever get back to you?
Yeah,
Can you give
I-
us a hint that they said?
I'm not actually sure that I know. I just know that you have a position.
Okay.
Sorry, I apologize. Which question? I'm trying to see where my colleague is. I apologize. Which?
So we're wondering if Vermont educators, are you looking, as you were the main drafters of this bill, to pull in administrators as well, or just teachers?
So, for the record, Ted Fisher again, our general feeling on this is that, the metaphor I used earlier, which may be imprecise, I apologize, is if you're going to lead the troops, then you probably should have the same standard. So we're not concerned about the idea of having principals meet that requirement in terms of alignment to the definition in chapter 51. Where we get into the sticky wicket is this professionally licensed definition. And that's something, like I said, my colleague Andrew can speak to.
So you're proposing that principals, superintendents, others in the administration would also do this roughly, was it 64 hours of training?
Yes.
Okay, Senator, you're looking to say.
No, it was, I think you sort of asked the question that I was gonna ask, which is administrators can encompass a lot of folks, so you want the, across the, okay.
Not all and understanding that it is still a pretty all-encompassing group. Not all administrators require a license, but the ones who do are considered to be educators. And so our feeling is that broad brushstrokes, again, with that provisional question, notwithstanding broad brushstrokes, if you're a licensed Vermont educator, you should have this understanding. Educators, principal, and this is where I'm like, we're getting to the limit of my expertise, so I'll mention this to Andrew, and if he wants to say more, and if you permit that, Vermont educators who are administrators also have professional learning requirements, just as all other is part of, and have to maintain their license, just as a classroom teacher would have to. So we see that as appropriate.
Senator Sheen.
Thank you. I think two questions. So sorry if you already covered this, but on line 5, page 2, when we're talking about newly licensed Vermont educators, should we include the word professionally licensed?
That's why that's highlighted there.
Okay.
Yep.
Sorry. So, and then the other question, I think, I guess more of a comment, I do want to hear more as to why, principals, for example, should go through this literacy instruction training, but at least, from the way I see their role, it's really more logistical and, making sure the, lights are on and everything's still running. So I don't know that having them go through a 40+ hour program to learn about evidence-based literacy instruction is entirely pertinent to their daily role. So, and I know they have a lot on their shoulders. I mean, everybody working in these schools has a lot on their shoulders. I don't know if adding this to their plate necessarily makes sense, but happy to hear more about it.
Yeah, I'd like to hear more as well. We'll have the BPA and those folks in to weigh in on this probably tomorrow or the day after. And I mean, I can see both sides of it. Yeah, if the person at the helm is setting the culture and this, it's sort of the academic feel for everything would be great, but 46 additional hours on top of everything else that they're doing seems like a lot, unless they're teaching a class or having supporting the students in something.
So I agree with you. But it would also be helpful to understand what other professional development requirements each of these educators is bumping into on an annual basis. So we're not, to your point, to everyone's point, adding more burden on top of burden that they may not be able to handle. Just being able to understand that development, professional development landscape would be very helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, because there might be, and I think Senator Kulik may have raised this last week, if we hear from the standards board, is there something that we might take off? Because this is really important, but maybe there's some give and take a little bit, yeah. Yes, Ted.
Just one hypothetical which might help in thinking through this, which is that the majority of educators are licensed for 5 years. 90% sure that that's the right number, but the license lasts for a period of years. And for example, being a principal is an endorsement that that you have on top of your educator license.
Mhm.
And so it's very possible that, let's say I have a French teacher, language endorsement, and I also have a principal endorsement. It's very possible that I might be employed in 2024 for this school year as a principal, and I might decide to take another job as a French educator the following year. So you do run into these kind of things when you try to parse out the endorsement areas, and split administrators off from the base of their license. You do kind of run into these sort of strange hypotheticals where you might have someone who meets the requirements in year one because you say we're exempting everyone with an administrator endorsement who's working as an administrator. You're also weighing in on, and I am not an attorney, and I would defer to Ledge Counsel or even maybe go and ask AOE Legal. And perhaps Andrew can speak to this because he deals with licensing more often. The question of endorsements is something that is established in the standards board rule. And you might be, if you try to unpack that, you might be sort of getting into their area. And I know that you, of course, can preempt them, but it might just, if you make that decision to go that way, it may, I'm not sure what unintended consequences it could have. We don't have an administrator license that's separate from an educator license right now. It's done through endorsements.
Senator Kulik, when you were reviewed as a teacher, did the principal come down usually? I'm just thinking, would the principal need some of this in order to review a class and say, gosh, this is really on track, or wait, things are off the rails? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, you typically are assessed and observed by an administrator, so that is a good point. And would you mind if I?
No, please go.
I also was gonna say that one thing that we need to think about is that a lot of our teachers, and I don't have the data, but it would be interesting to get the data. A lot of our teachers become administrators, so they will have training.
Yeah.
And so, excuse me, do we want a population of administrators where like 50% have training and 50 don't? Or whatever the number is, it might be better just to mandate it, since that's what, I don't know, something for us to think about.
Yeah. please.
Just curiosity question. Is it intended that this is a one-time training? Because to Bailey's point that this is a 5-year cycle.
Yeah, so this would be for the agency of education, they drafted it, even though please go ahead. This is a one-time training?
What?
For the record, Ted Fisher, Vermont Agency of Education, the idea is to have them go through the training, and then newly licensed educators.
I get
go
that.
through it.
It's in there.
So
Do they have to renew every?
You said every 5 years.
currently, as we've proposed it, it's not renewed. You would do it once and then we would check at your next renewal. Also, this is my colleague Andrew Prouton.
Hello, see you on the screen.
Okay, St. James, before we move to Andrew and other things, I think there's some more I would like.
Yes, but I wanted, before we move on from this, I
Okay.
just asked Morgan to post a link to the definitions section for this chapter that we are working in Title 16 and print out the definitions for you all.
Oh, great.
So that you can have that for this discussion. Because. So let me just read the term administrator, and I think
Okay.
the definition, and I think you will see where I'm going with this. So this bill proposes to put a new statute in a chapter with a definition section. So the definitions, unless you carve out other language, would automatically apply to this section, correct? So the term administrator means an individual licensed under this chapter, the majority of whose employed time in a public school, school district, or supervisory union is assigned to developing and managing school curriculum, evaluating and disciplining personnel, or supervising and managing a public school system or public school program. So the terms in this section are around the role the individual is playing at a point in time. So if you want to apply this requirement, not just to the role that an individual is serving at a specific time, but to the endorsements that they hold or the specific licensure provisions that they hold, we may need to add some language to this. To make it clear. So for example, to use the example that Ted just gave, which I think was really helpful in highlighting this. If you, for the sake of argument, want this requirement to apply to both teachers,
Right.
the folks in the classroom doing the teaching, and for the sake of argument, anyone who could be considered an administrator,
Mhm.
in Ted's example, the vice principal or the principal may also hold an endorsement that would allow them to be a French teacher, okay? But if we're just looking at a point in time, that person would meet the definition of administrator. If you just carve out, if you just, let's say you don't use the term educator, let's say you use the term teacher and principals because you don't want everyone who might meet the definition of educator to have to take these learning modules. Then you may run into a situation where someone who is not specifically called out in this section would not have to take the learning module because they don't fit into this definition, but they hold an endorsement that would allow them to fit into another definition.
Mhm.
And so they could be in that next year a teacher instead of an administrator, but they haven't been required to take the module yet. And so then that requirement may kick in at a different time, depending on how folks are using their endorsements.
If they're going back into the classroom, that's gonna kick something off eventually.
Depending
if
on
that's what you
how
wanna
we
do.
structure this, right? So if you want everyone who fits in that definition of educator, so educator means any teacher or administrator,
Mhm.
and then administrator means everyone I just talked about. You could carve off just principals, but you're leaving some other folks behind.
Mhm.
The term educator includes teacher or administrator, so that's gonna include pretty much everyone who's licensed, most folks who are licensed by the standards board. But the definitions in Title 16 and Chapter 51, so we're not working with the state board's rules.
Right.
We're working with Chapter 51. Are to a moment in time. If you want to tie this requirement to the endorsement that someone holds, I'm just suggesting we may need to be specific about that, not just using the definitions in this chapter. I think you all need to just figure out the broad category of
and then
folks,
we can-
and then I'll craft the language for
But
you.
that's helpful, that's,
And then the only other addition here is on page 3, section 4,
Mhm.
starting on line 6. So this is a requirement that AOE submit recommendations to the standards board on how to strengthen educator preparation programs. They also have to simultaneously communicate those recommendations to the educator programs themselves. And then we added a requirement that they communicate those recommendations to you all as well. And that's it.
please.
Yeah, thank you. So, it's not a question for Beth, but just something to kind of ponder. I was thinking about this bill this weekend. And I was thinking that, this is all about, results oriented programs, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm wondering if it's appropriate somewhere in this bill to build in a review of its success. You get 4 or 5 years down the road, what are the metrics showing? It's not having the desired effect. Groups got to come back together and reevaluate the course for the next 4 or 5 years. Sometimes, because no, not necessarily a sunset, but a review. Not a sunset, because I don't want to just like go to a cliff and die. It's gotta get to a point, a milestone in time, enough time, people, whoever, agrees, how much is enough time. If you really want a results-oriented program, it's gotta be based on metrics, and it's gotta have a milestone where it pivots or stays on track. Without that, it's just another, it has potential to become the first page, line 14, another outdated practice. And you can't legislate outdated practices.
I think it's a really good point. Were you gonna say something?
I am.
Beautiful.
There is already some of this built into current law.
Okay, good.
So the powers and duties of the standards board includes a requirement that, now this isn't exactly on point, Senator Weeks, it's not in the bill, it's in current law. So it's in Title 16 in Chapter 51, the professional educators title, chapter. It's section 1694, which is the powers and duties of the standards board. It requires the standards board not less than every 5 years to review its continuing education and other continuing competency requirements for professional educators. And then it has certain things that they need to put in writing when they do that review. So that's for continuing education or continuing competency requirements. And then, let's see. For educator preparation programs, see.
You do that for every building, right?
Yeah. Especially if you're introducing a new program.
I would encourage you to hear directly from the subject matter experts on the field on whether or not that's actually happening. It does appear that this is the purpose of the results-oriented program approval process. And so I would encourage you to hear directly from the field on what's actually happening.
Well, that's encouraging, because I hope that process would lead to this kind of review, but, to raise a flag that this is the results of a legislative review. And we need to address literacy because of the following reasons, then move forward.
Senator Shane.
Yeah, thanks. I was just gonna say, to that point, I can kind of see 2 aspects of it, or I guess 2 sides of it, and I think that looking at literacy scores, yeah, I think that's one way to see, about the effectiveness, but, if literacy scores are going up, that's obviously a good thing, but there could also be other factors that are causing the scores to go up, so I think. So are you getting at, look to see if this particular program is effective down the road? That's, yeah.
Senator Williams, the second.
So if this is already a statute and they're doing it, obviously, at what level?
No, they're not.
They're just doing, they're doing the 5-year review. Standards Board is doing a 5-year review.
Standard board?
Yeah,
Continuing competency requirement.
Yeah. Just, yeah. Sandra.
For clarity, can I get, cause I'm not understanding what provision of this bill are you talking about? Are you
Overall.
specifically,
Just overall.
but I mean, but. For example, there's a part of this bill that talks about the literacy council. So are you mostly pointing at the modules? Is that what you're?
No, I'm pointing at getting results, establishing metrics, getting results and reacting to those results. If you really want evidence-based and data-driven, you gotta build it in.
I know,
And
I understand that, I think this bill has a lot of disparate provisions, and it'll have even more once we add the imagination library.
yeah, I get that,
So
but it's a multi-section, it's a,
So yeah, it's a combination, I think, with, correct me if I'm wrong, between 204 and this, and the section of 303 where the modules become required. I would think that in 5 years, I speak for myself, I would love to see those reading scores up. And I think we will, recognizing that there are a lot of other things that could happen that could raise them or lower them. But that does seem like we can talk to Andrew to see, what should we be seeing in 5 years? Should we really start to see? Keeping the imagination library out of it, which I don't think is going, it's big. But I think what we're talking about is the S204 and this requirement.
Okay, I just wanted some clarity
Yeah,
on what
yeah.
parts you were talking about, thank you.
So I think that it's important that the administrator, the principal, whatever, should at least know what, if he takes instruction. So I think it's important that the teachers know, he knows.
I'm inclined, but yeah, we'll hear from Andrew. If principals are observing what teachers are doing and they're going in, it does seem to make sense, but I also recognize that principals and everybody have a lot on their plates, and could we pull something off for their, I don't, Andrew, help us with this in terms of their keeping up with their certification, et cetera, so that they can focus on this. Take 5 minutes, Andrew, please come on up while we take 5 minutes, get yourself comfortable, we've got a lot of questions. And
We're glad that you're a real person.
we're really
I
glad
heard
that
you
you're
mention
here.
many times.
So sorry.
Sorry for coming late.
So sorry, guys.
Yeah.
Heard whatever, but we're really grateful. and
Oh my
we're
gosh.
Say your name came up.
Really value
I
added, so. Really.
I just.
It's all positive, but
It just,
Don't forget where you came from.
I'm usually fairly
Guys, just remember,
organized,
this
so-
is still. Just wanna make sure.
no, I just was thanking her for
We're still
taking our
on.
webinar yesterday.
Oh, great.
So,
great.
no, nothing, but thank you.
I don't want her to say anything about it.
Never.
No, never, exactly.
But
Anyway.
so-
Are we off?
We're trying to, I'm getting us.
Oh my.
Actually, really good for everything in the